Corp, good to see you.
Hello.
Oh, perfect. Perfect time. Great. And we are live. Okay, good. Hi. Well, good evening, everyone.
How are you?
Hi, everybody.
We are, sorry, go ahead. Welcome to the April 20th workshop meeting of the Board of Education. We have 8 board members present in person and through Zoom. And we're going to call the meeting to order and start with our Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Excellent. And I want to thank special thanks to Julia, Adrian, and Amanda at West Rocks for leading us in the pledge tonight. Tonight we have a work session to go over the facilities study that we've been working on for several months. And to get us started, I'm going to kick it over to the Superintendent, Dr. Estrella.
Thank you, Chairman. So as we continue to engage in the work of looking at where the district is and where we want to take the district, we've had a number of studies that have been underway and some which have concluded and some that continue. We've had, as many of you can recall, the equity project. We had a special education review. We are in the midst of conducting an HR review as well, and several other studies, including the listening and learning tour that I engaged in with members of the board, as well as the Connecticut Center for School Change and their work in looking at the previous strategic plan and where the work was as a result of the great things that happened during the previous administration, but also pointing out the things that we need to continue to focus on to strengthen Norwalk and the work that we're doing as a district. As part of the work, we also wanted to ensure that we were looking at our facilities and infrastructures to ensure that they are in alignment to the work and work environment that we want to create for our students so that they can have the learning environment necessary for them to be successful. So we have the Newman and DLR group here today to present the findings of the facility study that we conducted for the past few weeks. They've done an incredible job of really looking at the infrastructure of our facilities and really created a really robust review process that will allow us to have a scope of work for the next 20 years and have a deeper understanding of what we need to do to better align our environment to the programming needs of our schools, but also to the expectations that we need to set for ourselves as we align ourselves better to the workforce and what the workforce is demanding of our students so that they can be successful as they exit Norwalk. So I'm going to turn it over to the Newman and DLR team to present to us some of the findings and recommendations of the review that they've conducted. And hopefully we will have a very rich dialogue tonight that will initiate the conversation of how we need to set the path ahead for the next 20 years so that we continue to develop and move the district forward in a positive direction as we align the facilities also to the instructional models and needs of the district.
Thanks, Alex. I'm going to start my share.
Sounds good.
Can everybody see okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, Steven's going to kick us off.
My video started, but perhaps I should begin as I wait for that. It seems to be slow. Well, thank you, Dr. Estrella. We are here tonight, the Newman DLR team, of course, representing Newman's local experience and DLR's national expertise. And I have to begin by saying that the experience working with Dr. Estrella and your whole team has really been incredible, an incredible level of engagement. I'm here tonight with many representatives of our study.
Steven, I think we lost you.
We have Pam and Jana and Marilyn, I believe. Our consultant team will be available as well for questions, including Eric with CES, MEP engineers, and Michael O'Reilly, the cost estimator. And really, we want to acknowledge the incredible engagement that you've all provided with us during the study. The core planning group with Dr. Estrella and Frank, Tom and Brenda, Bill and George with facilities, and of course, the Board of Education as well. Lastly, we'd want to acknowledge the integration with those running parallel district efforts, Mike Zuba with SLR and Richard Lemons with the Connecticut Center for School Change. So on the screen here, you see the agenda items for tonight's report. What we are going to share tonight is a distillation of the final report. Not every detail, obviously, it's a quite extensive report, but a distillation of the major findings. And we'll be pausing as we go for any questions that you have. There'll be a pause marker in the upper right corner of each slide when we will be able to take questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Pam.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen. So I think one of the things that we were really struck by is with all of the conversations that we had with different stakeholders, be they the students, be they the community, be they teachers, be they administrators, there really was this singular passion about meeting students kind of where they are. So all of our pause marks are really quotes from your students that really represented you all so well. So hard to believe, but 12 weeks ago, we started on our little adventure, and we promised you that as a team, we would work together to help raise the bar and close the gap, and that we would be sure that the end results were data-driven, research-informed, and community-inspired. I think that's particularly important because there's a lot of information, and it needs to be transparent, and it needs to be, if you will, part of the overall community dialogue. I remember in one of our meetings, one of your stakeholders asked a question: why would you include quite so much stakeholders? Why don't you kind of just tell us what to do? But I think certainly our team feels, and I believe your leadership team also feels, that this is a dialogue about all of the priorities, and it needs to then be crafted so that it really starts to balance your aspirations and your priorities and the funding realities so that it represents you as a unique district. So if we go to the next slide, we have walked 20 sites. We've reviewed existing enrollment, demographics, and capacity. We've met with the principals at, it says each of the schools, I should say most of the schools. We've had 6 collabs that were virtual that included close to 250 different stakeholders, 27 meetings, and that doesn't include some of the kind of 3 Zoom meetings that we ended up having with leadership a day as all of this information came together. So what I wanted to say, though, before I turn it over to Alex for a second, is we are not necessarily going to go over all of the process and all the different meetings that we went through. This is very much about the, and so what, right? What are the outcomes? So if there are any questions related to specific collabs or specific conversations, certainly we can take that at the end. They've been well documented in the facilities plan because those really start to serve the basis of, the weaving the strands together that include, if you will, deferred maintenance, physical assessment, educational adequacy, demographics and capacity, and really so much more that is part of any conversation that a district is faced with. But we thought before we really dove into, if you will, the meat of this document is, if I could ask Dr. Estrella, we've got a couple slides because there were three major themes that really started to be, key priorities in how this facilities plan evolved.
So thank you, Pam. So as we engage in the conversation of how we were going to kind of lead the work around the facilities study, there are three priority areas that we wanted to keep in mind as we thought through this process. The first one is the ever evolving change that is happening within the field and how we need to make adjustments to our educational structure to align to what the workforce is demanding. So one overarching theme for us as we thought about this work was the concept of our youth are pushing and the workforce is pulling. Education and educational facilities must change to meet those needs. So as we think about our facilities, we wanted to keep in mind that we had to have a mindset of forward thinking so that we could anticipate based on what we're learning within the workforce, what's happening there, and what are the things that we need to do differently to ensure that our students, when they graduate, are well equipped to engage in whatever the pathway is in college, or if they decide to go directly into the workforce, be prepared to know how to take the rim and move forward and have a productive lifestyle as a result of what their path is, because they chose to be there, not because they didn't have any option to go there. And as we thought about the work, we wanted to ensure that as we map out a 20-year plan, we're taking into account the shifts that are happening and how we need to adjust our environment so that the learning that's happening in the schools can also evolve over time to meet the changes that are essential in the educational field so that our students are well equipped and prepared for the workforce. The other piece that we looked at that was really important for us was educational equity, right? And the concept of the fact that it doesn't mean parity, right? It means meeting every student where they are, despite any learning, despite their language and the language that they're trying to learn, despite if they have a disability. How do we accommodate the environment or shift the environment to really ensure that all students have access to the resources and learning experiences that we offer within our organization? And if we as a system need to make adjustments to ensure that all students have the opportunity to have an outstanding education, then what are those things that we need to shift or rethink around our facilities to ensure that we set the pathway to do that effectively? And I think the third piece that we really engage in a deeper conversation around is thinking about what is the 20-year trajectory from now, 20 years from now, that we need to keep in mind, so that as we're thinking about our budgets and what we aspire for, we're not only thinking about what we need in the moment, but what we will need 20 years from now. And as I articulated earlier, the workforce is constantly changing, constantly evolving. So what are those critical components of our environment that we need to focus on that will equip our students to be successful, regardless of how the workforce is shifting and changing, not only within our country, but globally as well?
So awesome. Thank you, Dr. Estrella. I mean, these are trends, these are benchmarks that we're seeing nationally, but I think that as articulated, they really start to capture the heart and soul of the Norwalk School District and really reflect in your words what your priorities are. And, you know, we, the team, totally believe that schools are, you know, kind of the local culture and context. And that North Star is what really gives you the kind of facilities that really engage students, teachers, and the community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jana, and we're going to do a quick dive into all of the results of our 459-page facilities plan.
Thank you, Pam. So just want to touch upon enrollment. We've been working with Mike Zuba from SLR, which is the demographer that the district has engaged, and he will be also producing a report that goes hand in hand with our facility studies plan. And so we've been really looking at the number of students per level, pre-K, kindergarten through 5, 6 through 8, and then the high school levels. And really also, he's been looking at then the distribution across the district and how that distribution should be impacting our recommendations and our facilities plan. We've also, with him, have been looking at both functional capacity as well as maximum capacity, understanding those future enrollment projections, and making sure that we can accommodate the bumps and swells through the grades, and from year to year as those, you know, grade numbers change, as you know, you might have a bubble and it goes all the way through the school district. Well, making sure that our recommendations and our plans can accommodate those changes over time, that might just be short-term changes and not necessarily, you know, the long-term changes. So next slide, Rachel. So the primary change factors besides the projections, obviously the projections are, enrollment projections are one piece, but the other primary change factors we have been working with as a design team has been what came out of the 2016 strategic operating plan, which was pre-K at every elementary. We've been looking at, okay, if we implement that fully, how does that affect the number of students in those schools? What we have proposed in our report is to provide at least one pre-K, at least one, sometimes two, but at least one pre-K at every elementary school through the district. Now, obviously that means that we, you know, by increasing those numbers in those particular facilities, you're decreasing other numbers at the grades K through 5. So what does that do to the district and how can we accommodate that? Then a secondary factor that's affecting the change in capacity has to do with our educational adequacy response. You know, we've been looking at how your schools meet the needs of future teaching and learning, and the responses and recommendations that we have made in some cases in some schools does reduce the capacity by, you know, a little bit. And then the last thing that really has an impact, especially at particularly the high school level, is school scheduling and curriculum policy, and the whole conversation around owned versus not owned classrooms, or sometimes it's called reserved classrooms versus unreserved classrooms, and how that may or may not change over time. And quite honestly, digging deep into what the high schools are currently doing, you know, is a part of that conversation. So next. So the big picture results of our exploration, you know, at the pre-K, you can see that the existing is, you know, versus the proposed, that we're actually going up quite a bit in that area. Again, this is that implementation of the pre-K across the district, and not just at a few schools. Then at the kindergarten through 5 level, you notice that actually is slightly going down, but only just a very little bit. And I want to just point out that those numbers of that, you know, 5662 actually does include a new South Norwalk. When you take out those numbers from the pre-K as well as some of the educational adequacy, then you actually do need a new school within the district. And we've looked at various options and had a community meeting, and the city is very much committed. And the mayor made a huge commitment that they're going to see that this can happen. And there are things I know that are in the works for that, you know, stay tuned for that down the road. Then at the 6 through 8 level, we actually are increasing the capacity by a little bit. Again, the idea of those numbers include expanded capacity for a new Columbus Magnet School. Currently, there's 1 section per grade in that school. We're actually, with the proposal, increasing it to 3 sections per grade so that school can have a truly robust experience at that 6 through 8 level. What it also does is it actually helps some of the bottlenecking that is happening at some of the other middle schools, particularly Rowton, I know has had some challenges, and the projections would show that it would continue to have challenges, and it would help to relieve some of that pressure. So really, again, we're trying to, at those levels, balance the capacity in the district across all of the areas of the city. And then at the high school level, so the numbers that you see here on the left under the existing, the 2430 is if we took all of the capacity generating classrooms and we just simply multiplied them in a very sort of like simplistic way, you'd get a capacity about 2430. Well, in actual fact, your current enrollment is above that. So how is that happening? Well, as it turns out, when we dug into the scheduling with all 4 of the high schools, we actually found that there is actually quite a bit of sharing already happening. It's actually a hybrid in the way that they're currently scheduling those 4 schools. And so that raises, it allows you to be able to have 3650 approximate enrollment in the existing arrangement. Now, looking at both the projected capacity of the new Norwalk High School at 1,500 for Norwalk High School and then 500 for PreK Norwalk, you'd get, and then you add that to the potential capacity at Brian McMahon, you actually could accommodate as many as 4180 at the high school level, in a model where it was unreserved classrooms. And so those are just looking at all 3, the baseline, the hybrid, and then a completely unreserved model, which would mean then that you would not have to increase the size, say, of Brian McMahon, and you'd be able to work within your existing building with some modifications that may make it more flexible and more universally usable to actually accommodate your future growth at the high school level if it stayed, within the projections that SLR is looking at. So let's take a look at the next slide. So now we're at one of those plazas. This, again, another great quote by a high school student during our day in the life. I feel like we just think of classes in the singular way, but in reality, we should be thinking about how math class connects to this other class. It would make us better learners. I just love that quote. I think that they really have the pulse on what is inquiry-based learning and what is enriched learning. So with that, I will just pause for a moment, see if there's any questions. None?
Yeah, go ahead.
You want to go? Okay. Yeah, I just have one question. I was just looking at the numbers, unless I'm not reading this correctly, but when we're looking at the existing, when you have the pre-K, which was 268, K through 5, 5,698, 6 through 8, I show in my document as 2,553, but you were mentioning, and it shows on the slide, 2,608.
Yes. So you got it. You got it. They won the pre PowerPoint that we released last week was before I had a very crucial conversation with the principal at Rowton Middle School. And I did increase the numbers of existing at the Rowton Middle School by 3 sections per grade, or a total of 3 sections, 1 section per grade there. And so that was the cause for the increase.
Okay, but I just wanted to make sure because I was showing different numbers. Okay.
Yes.
And just if I can quickly, if I can also, if we just go back though, we were talking about the pre-K at every elementary school. And I've always felt, over the years, how important it was to have a preschool at every elementary school. Just thinking the transition, how it makes for a seamless transition, versus having different preschools, having it in each respective building, each elementary school, having that child go from pre-K to K, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, and so on. But I think it's just more of a comfort level and also learning for our students as well. It's just that transition, and also with siblings all in the same school. So I do like the idea of having a pre-K section in every single school, every elementary school. And that's something that for me, I've advocated for many, many years. And I thought the importance of that is huge. So I'm glad that we're able to discuss that tonight.
And just to add a little comment, I mean, this may seem like a silly comment, but you guys are actually blessed with a lot of bathrooms in classrooms. and so what that means is, that incorporation is certainly a lot easier than having to add a lot of bathrooms in existing structures.
Good point. Thank you.
And I just wanted to, just to clarify, the numbers under the proposed column are based on the numbers that we'll get from SLR.
The numbers for proposed is actually what we're proposing, including our interventions.
Got it.
So it is not the enrollment projections. What we've tried to do is align our proposed as closely as we could with those enrollment projections, always making sure that we at least accommodated them. You will see probably in the final report, the high school is really touch and go. It's right there. So as we all know, we can't exactly predict the future. So the high school is probably where you have the potential for needing a little more space at some point in the very far future, looking at those enrollment projections, but who knows, maybe not. We're right there, we're really close. We always like to have a little bit, because again, it's the difference between optimal capacity versus maximum capacity. You can't say that if at a school you've got 414 seats, well, as we all know, you can't always fill all 414, especially when you have neighborhood schools, because as the grades grow and swell, and as people make different choices, it's almost impossible. So you want to be able to always accommodate what you expect the maximums to be, but then understanding that oftentimes it might be just a little bit less. Somewhere in the range of 5 to 10% less oftentimes is what it turns out to be. And again, I also just want to make a point. A school where you have an application process that's very popular, like the Columbus Magnet, especially at those lower grades, because it's an application process and they have a waiting list, they actually can fill those seats. And so, it's a little bit different when you have a school like that than when you have a school that's a neighborhood school that, it's drawing from a pool around it, and you can't always predict exactly how many families are going to move in and who's going to stay and all that kind of, those kind of factors.
Thank you.
So are we ready to move on? Are there any other questions for this portion? And again, we'll be taking questions at the end.
Can you just explain the math though? Because if you're going to be building a new school, right? So that's got to be the new South Norwalk school would be PK 5. That'd be 500 kids roughly. And you're adding, you're switching around some of the pre-K, or you're adding 250 spots of pre-K, but you're keeping your K-5 the same. So I can't figure out the math.
Well, in the educational adequacy, one of the things that we're doing is we're actually, in some cases, to make for a robust choice and having greater opportunities and basically meeting the inquiry-based learning model. To do that and to create maker spaces and other things, in some places, we actually are recommending that you are making a regular classroom into a maker space that is shared amongst a cluster of classrooms. Now, that doesn't mean it's just a direct one-to-one, you've lost that classroom. Typically, what we do then is at some level, we distribute what would have been in that class to the other adjacent classes. It's kind of like everybody shares that space, but it still results in some cases in a net loss at individual schools. There are other reasons also in looking at the various schools, like for instance, right now at say West Rocks, there are portables. And so at that particular school, to eliminate those portables, we have to do one of two things. You either increase the capacity at that school, you increase the capacity of 6 through 8 somewhere else, or you reduce the capacity at West Rocks. And what we've actually chosen in that case is we've shifted some of that capacity to the new Columbus magnet. So when you go through the actual report and you see each individual recommendation, then the numbers will start to make sense. This is just the aggregate and the overall proposed numbers. I'm not going into the detail of every single school and the pluses and minuses.
And I was going to add that the pre-K students, they exist. They're not additional to what is projected in the enrollments, and that many of them are currently in alternative pre-K options. So the numbers that are above them are including all of the pre-K students that aren't currently picked up by the public system.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that part. I'm thinking more about physical capacity, that you're building a new school, yet if you look at pre-K 8, yet you're only adding about half the capacity of that new school. That's why I was confused. But I guess if Baker space does take up that much, I guess that explains some of it. But
I think when we look at the educational adequacy, certainly raise the question again if you don't feel that it's being adequately answered.
Okay.
Mike, are you thinking of the growth, like for the pre-K?
I'm just looking at PK through 8th grade.
Yeah.
If you total those numbers up, you're building a whole new school, yet the numbers don't seem to quite be reflecting that, but whatever.
The new school, the way that it currently is, we're actually adding, only one section per grade in total at the 6th through 8 over what currently exists. But there's some actual modifications at some other locations. For instance, West Rocks right now, those portables, we're actually saying, let's not keep those portables at West Rocks. Kids shouldn't be in portables. So looking at that school, we would not keep that, and we would actually reduce the numbers there and we would push it somewhere else. And similarly in Roten, there's a lot of capacity there. And so we're actually taking some of that Roten capacity and pushing it into another section per grade in Columbus Magnet in the new school. At the South Norwalk Elementary School, the numbers that we've used, and again, this is still under development from the district as far as how big that will actually be, but we've actually used a model that would have 2 sections per grade for pre-K at that new location, and then 3 sections per grade at the upper grades, kindergarten through 5. And so that's only adding 414 students maximum capacity at that location. So when you take yes, there is still a bit of a delta, but it's not quite as big as you might imagine. When we shift over to that school, it's somewhere in around 150 kids that have been not displaced, but like reworking the capacities at these other schools and saying we're instead of busing them to say a long way away, we're going to be keeping them in South Norwalk. And so in doing that, we've also then completely changed some of the recommendations of how we would teach at these places to really get at that inquiry-based learning model. One of the biggest takeaways from every single visioning session that we did and day in the life session that we did was that, and I'm not even kidding, even the 5th through 8th graders made this statement that they're really wanting to have an inquiry-based learning model. It should be a cycle of learning with different activities, and different activities take different types of spaces. It's, one size of space does not fit all activities. And one of the things that we're recommending is that you have a mixture of spaces similar in size to the classrooms that you have now, but also the ability to have bigger spaces, maybe, approximating the size of 2 classrooms together, but then also half-size classroom spaces, and then, even then small group spaces. So it would be this variety of spaces, and you would schedule the activities to the appropriate space and provide variety. It allows also that concept of meeting kids where they are, kids that do better in smaller groups versus kids that actually do better and thrive, the introverts versus the extroverts that thrive in an environment where there's larger groups. It really allows then the teaching and learning to completely be tailored, and that spaces can respond to that. And oftentimes we're also providing for for making those spaces flexible. So in one period of the day, it might be a combined space that's larger, but then in the next period of the day, it might divide up into 3, intermediate sized spaces to accommodate 3 smaller groups. So in doing that, there is just a very modest at each of the schools that were maybe at a larger than capacity than what they might have wanted to be. We've lost some students at those schools and we're redirecting them then to the South Norwalk, and making it all then better education for everyone.
Could you just talk for 1 second about, you said something about Roten, but I didn't quite follow that. I know that the thinking used to be there was a lot of capacity and there's only 2 houses there, but in fact, they've allowed a lot of non-named districted kids to attend. Their enrollment has surged, and I think they are at 3 houses now, aren't they?
They are at 3 houses. Yes, in actual fact, they're at 27 sections per grade, or not 27 sections per grade, 9 sections per grade so 27 sections total. Their actual spaces, to do that, they've actually had to use some really small rooms. Some of their classrooms are down around, just over 500 square feet, which is, when you think about a normal class size, it's not quite half, but it's almost half. Your classrooms for 28 students at the middle school level should be somewhere in the 860 to 870 square feet to accommodate 28 students. And so think about, what that means there at Roten. So part of what we're doing is we're right sizing some of those spaces and saying that maybe they shouldn't have as many as kids at that school for the number of classrooms that they actually have that can accommodate it, and just rethinking it. But yeah, Roten right now and potentially in the future, based on what the demographic enrollment projections are showing, we really need to rethink and redistribute some of those kids to make it a better learning experience for all.
Great, thank you.
So I have a question as it relates to safety. When looking at the design of the school, what school lockdown or active shooter response standards are you referencing when designing windows, open spaces? In terms of pre-planning, what standard are we currently referencing when we're designing this?
Well, a couple of things. We always designed with CEPTED principles in mind. And we actually did have a collab with the security team for the district that included officers, police officers from Norwalk, as well as the district-wide security director and a group of people that from each of the schools that actually handle security within the schools. But we also want to talk a lot about relational safety. I mean, it's interesting because if you look at schools, quite honestly, right here in Connecticut, say, in Newtown and places like that, Sandy Hook School, it's making schools, locking them down and making them prison-like without glass doesn't actually make them safer. The day-to-day life that a student deals with is much more about bullying and intimidation. And quite honestly, having actually a lot of connections between spaces and sight lines and visual connections from classrooms to other spaces, from offices to other spaces, actually improves that relational safety. And it actually drastically reduces the likelihood of bullying and intimidation happening in those spaces like bathrooms and hallways and stairways, where we all know that those are the crucial places. So in making these recommendations, we actually are introducing greater visibility. That does not mean, though, that you still can't implement lockdown procedures if there was ever an intruder. And in fact, you also see as part of our recommendations, and I will let Rachel get into the nitty-gritty of some of the technology, but even like, say, at vestibules, you'll notice that when you look at the plans in the report, that we always are highlighting the vestibules and making sure that even if they have currently a vestibule, that doesn't necessarily mean it has an appropriate connection to a person in the front office so that somebody can check in before they're actually entering the school. So oftentimes, right, we're saying, an intervention needs to happen to make that vestibule actually acceptable so that it is safe and secure. But let's even take a classic example, like say Brookside, that has a great vestibule. You actually can check in with the office before you actually enter the building. Even there, we've been asked to include some film so that it would be a little bit of hardening at that area against, like I wouldn't call it bulletproof, but definitely hardening against, gunfire and things of that nature. Obviously, it's a very delicate subject, and the school does need to feel comfortable with their security policies. But if you actually tour some of the schools that have actually come back from an event like this, they're still filled with those visual connections and glass and happy and pleasant and have daylight and those types of things.
Yep. And Rachel, maybe you would want to add, we did have quite a few conversations with the security consultants that's working for the district in terms of the infrastructure we have in place. And so that's been accommodated for in the physical assessment numbers.
Absolutely. And so there's a 2016 report that the district has been working to develop. And so we have included recommendations that are left from that are in progress, and took into account those standards and expectations and all the recommendations that we made.
Thank you.
Helen, if I could just add just a thought, just a comment. If we could discuss, but just going back to flexible seating, which every child learns differently, and I think flexible seating is really quite key to the success of our students. But our library media center, which is kind of the hub of each school, I assume that would be used for kind of small group gatherings, maybe large group gatherings, professional development, and so on. So I assume that would be, again, kind of the center or focal point of many of our schools. A while back, we discussed outdoor classrooms. I'm not sure if we're working on that or if that's something we're envisioning, especially in a COVID environment. But as the weather gets warmer, having students, they're outside during recess, but also having, small group instruction, during readers workshop, writers workshop, possibly math. So I'm not sure if we're incorporating any of that as well.
Yeah, I think you all are getting ahead of us. We've set this presentation up perfectly. That's exactly one of the things we're going to start talking about next in the next session. So unless anybody has any more questions about the capacity and enrollment piece, I think we'll dive into the facilities conditions and the educational adequacy recommendations, and then we'll pause again to talk about it again. Does that work?
Good question. So I'm a little bit confused about the numbers and just how they're broken down, but I believe the next meeting, we're going to dive into the numbers and how it relates to the different districts.
Yeah, so May 4th, the demographer, Mike Zuba is with us today, but he just as a partner in the conversation, but he will be joining us May 4th for the superintendent report, and he's going to provide a really in-depth presentation around the current demographics, enrollment numbers, projected numbers, so on and so forth.
Okay. And that'll obviously include the breakdown for South Norwalk. And
correct. There is an element that will discuss the South Norwalk project and provide different options for the board to consider.
Perfect. Thank you.
So let's go forward to the next one. And then, as Rachel said, I'll get back to that. Be sure to talk about the outdoor learning. So as Pam mentioned, we walked to all of your schools to look at their educational adequacy. And when we walked through, we actually had a checklist of items that was developed using the engagement indicators that you see here on the left. School as community resource, flexibility, safe and secure, stimulating architecture, innovative learning environments that connect, easy to operate, adaptability, thermally, visually, and acoustically comfortable, energy efficient and high performance, and healthy learning environment. Those 10 critical indicators that have been derived from research the DLR has done actually has been proven to have greater engagement when you incorporate those into schools. Greater engagement between teachers and students actually then results in better outcomes. So we wanted to make sure, using these 10 things, we developed a checklist, and as we walked around, we used them to see how well your schools were able to deliver on the promise of the inquiry-based learning and student and teacher engagement. Now on the right in the blue boxes are the 7 themes that came out of the values workshop that we did. Viewing architecture through the lens of user experience and sustainability is what is the acronym for values. And it's indoor environmental quality, equity and universal accessibility, supportive, flexible and adaptable, play, beauty and inspiration, emotional resilience, and access. And this is access to both the facilities as well as access to nature. So using that then as our lens, when we made recommendations, we used these 2 things to come up with sort of like first a score for each school, and then the a menu of items that we would be recommending that get implemented across the district in a sort of holistic way. So here you see the excerpts in this image of what we, the guide that we used, and we have the breakdown of site functionality and learning styles, environmental quality, as well as then the assessment of spaces. We did a sampling of spaces as well as looking at the highlighted spaces like cafeteria and gym and learning commons, and then outdoor amenities. And outdoor amenities includes like outdoor gardens as well as outdoor learning areas. Every school was then basically given scores between 1 and 5. 1 means it's basically non-existent or needs replacement. And then 5 means that it functions excellently. The majority of all the schools were somewhere between a 2 and a 4.5. And that then helped us develop the tiers along with the physical assessment criteria that Rachel is going to dive into, which then leads to the recommendations and the timeline. So next slide.
Question.
So taking that information, we actually then have.
Janet, I think
yes?
the board has some questions on the previous slide.
Okay.
Regarding the assessment score, was the school at all involved in self-rating? Just in being able to put context to the criterion that you're using to rate them?
So in some cases we got information, like for instance, Brian McMahon High School sent us a very detailed list of things that they felt like needed addressing. Mostly our information as far as how people wanted to teach, not how they were actually teaching, but how they wanted to teach, what came out of the day in the life and the visioning exercises and the values exercises, as well as even the feedback we got from the community during our tours and benchmark community meeting. We were not assessing what they were doing now as much as we were assessing their ability to do what they told us they wanted to do. So to the extent that, we saw when we walked into a school, we would look at it and say, are they able to do an inquiry-based learning model? Does the furniture, does the way that the classrooms are set up, does the way that they're able to relate or not relate to each other? Is there a variety of spaces that are actually accessible easily to teachers and to students on a fluid basis? Are those kinds of things available or not? We didn't actually take like a laundry list of everything that every principal or teacher thought was wrong with their school. We actually were doing it much more about from the perspective of where they wanted to go and saying whether or not the environment would allow them to do that. When it was, when possible, because of COVID, we were not allowed to tour the elementary schools when students were in the building. So in oftentimes, though, at the elementary school level, we toured those schools after hours or on the weekend. The middle schools, we actually did tour those during the day, as well as the high schools. So we actually had greater interaction with middle school principals on a one-to-one while we were touring. But the reality is that those were much more about, this is what we're teaching here, notice these classrooms here and the sizes of them. They weren't actually talking as much about those facilities and what they were looking to do. Those really came out of the workshops. So we do feel like that we had a really good sampling because all the principals participated, a teacher from each school participated, as well as the students and community members, that we have a really good understanding of where they're trying to go. And so we were looking at it from that perspective.
And as you go forward in formalizing designs, will there be opportunities for the schools to be involved again and giving input in terms of what's executed?
So just to be clear, we did not formalize designs. What we have is a menu of interventions that we're recommending. And so if at the point when these projects are going to then come and be, okay, now we're ready to address the tier 1 schools or the tier 2 schools or the tier 3 schools, when those become actual projects, at that stage, it becomes the real design. And I would expect then at that stage that those teachers and those principals and the users and the community that feed into those schools would have much greater involvement. But what we're actually doing, it's a sort of a complement of interventions to create scenarios that would allow for, like I said, the inquiry-based learning. It's also, quite honestly, recommending things like to deal with daylight and glare. So Meco shades, which is a roller shade that actually, instead of being solid, allows for filtered light and views out while still controlling glare. We're recommending furniture upgrades. Quite honestly, a lot of even the inquiry-based learning modalities can be accommodated through different furniture types without making certain changes to rooms as a first step. Obviously, that isn't the creation of maker spaces and collaboration space in such a robust way as what we're recommending in many places, but at least as a first step in all classrooms, that would be one way to get closer to that inquiry-based learning model that the district is seeking. So our recommendations aren't always just physical realignment of space. The other thing that we did is we actually identified areas where we felt like, okay, if you did a pretty heavy renovation, you would have a better use of space, versus in other cases, we said a light renovation for just upgrading finishes, lighting, and casework is all that's needed. But here you just get a sampling of all the different schools.
And Jana, I would add in, because I think there was the comment previously, a lot of the conversation about how to provide improved kind of architecture that enables. Just to be clear, we're not rating how the teachers were doing. This is how well the building supports the educational vision. But when Rachel starts to go through the numbers, there is a real focus on how one can minimize the amount of architectural interventions and provide that same kind of flexibility and adaptability through appropriate furniture, which is a much more cost-effective solution.
The other thing, just because this slide right here is a sampling of many of the intervention plans that we've done, and you can see the green ovals are actually where we're recommending more robust outdoor learning to occur and making it more purposeful. One of the recommendations that we actually, at pretty much every single school, was that there should be more robust and purposeful outdoor learning opportunities. Right now you have great spaces, but oftentimes they aren't taken advantage of to their fullest extent because they just aren't furnished and they just aren't arranged in such a way that they're actually like an outdoor classroom. It's just an open space.
Thank you.
So if we could go to the next slide, Rachel. So this is a list of things that we are like what we're calling sort of universal needs, and that pretty much every single school, these are the kinds of things that we are recommending. Again, at the top of the list, secure vestibules, and then furniture upgrades to provide for flexibility, adaptability, and quite honestly, movement. And I mean, what I mean by movement in that sense, it's actually the child's ability to move within their seat that helps to keep their brain engaged. Paint, carpet, acoustical tile upgrades, with the exception of a couple locations, many of the buildings need those throughout. Again, I mentioned those Meco shades to improve that indoor-outdoor connections while still providing glare control. Obviously, if you're doing a ground-up building, then I would actually recommend sunshades, especially on east, west, and south facades. Variety of spaces, this is getting to that idea of choice and really meeting the child where they are, as well as that inquiry-based learning model. Those collaborative project-based learning spaces, breakout spaces, the breakout spaces can be used even for pullouts for intervention, like a math intervention or a reading intervention, or even if a child needs just a little bit longer on a test or something like that, those breakout spaces, when designed correctly, can be incredibly useful and actually mean that you actually need less space and be effective as opposed to more. And then maker spaces, places where kids can tinker, explore, discover, and really, find their passion. Increased transparency, interdisciplinary connections, really allowing that, as that one of the quotes from the high school students, that cross-discipline connections. And we actually heard this from the teachers as well. They're so eager to make those connections, but right now all the classrooms are very cellular. It's like you're in the four walls, and because there's no connections and no places where you can get into an expanded area, that they feel limited, like they can't do those cross-disciplinary projects the way that they would like to. Then indoor air quality, incredibly important in today's world, but quite honestly, it's always important. It was important from the dawn of time, in that our brains do not function when there are high CO2 levels within a space. If you ever been in a meeting in a conference room and you're getting sleepy after being in there for an hour, it's probably because there isn't adequate ventilation and everybody's in there breathing, and without fresh air replenishing that air, you get tired, you get sleepy, your brain goes to sleep. So air quality is always important. And then improved lighting. Not only does the lighting have an effect just with your ability to see and stay on task, but quite honestly, in many of the schools that we toured, the fluorescent lights have a hum and a buzz, and that is problematic for anybody, but it's especially problematic for kids that have sensory issues. And so improving that lighting, so not only getting a really good quality, getting good balance, and then making sure that we get rid of the hum, as well as quite honestly providing for, again, choice in lighting. Like, do we want the classroom to be dim? Do we want only half the room to be lit and the other half to be dim? And so providing for choice.
Can I ask you a question? This is Erica.
Absolutely.
Just, because we got a copy of the presentation, I was just looking through to see if there was any specifics at the school level based on special education population and certain schools having specific programming for special education. Is there any nuanced recommendations for those schools that aren't included in this executive presentation?
So if they have existing programs, we definitely want to make sure that we had adequate space in right sizing and location. Like, for instance, at Nathan Hale, the self-contained classroom is sort of like over in a corner at the back near a back door. They're not actually out in and like involved with the rest of the population, if you will. And they're in a room that has really high windows. So while they have daylight up at the top, they have no views to the outside. And so in that case, we actually are making the recommendation that those kids get moved into an area where they're more a part of the student body and aren't kind of like tucked away in the back 40, but actually brought forward to be more integral and connected to the rest of their peers, if you will. And additionally, in the rest of the school, we want it to be holistically accessible. Again, that idea of that it's good for all children, the providing for choice, providing for different kinds of furniture, providing for different the ability to turn lighting higher or lower, is all about meeting those kids where they are. And I always like to say we're all on the spectrum. It's just all a matter of where we fall with regards to like what our issues are and how well we are good at one thing versus another. And so it's really trying to provide that choice so that the kids can find their place and the teachers can meet them in that place that suits them best. So that variety and all of those improved lighting and indoor air quality and all of those kinds of things are actually speaking to that, even though it may not be as obvious, but that is really what we're after there.
But Jenna, I think since people haven't necessarily seen the full gamut of the facilities plan, there is a lot of detail related to each individual school and recommendations.
Thank you for that.
Cool. Thank you, Jenna. So the next piece that we're going to talk about before our next pause for some comprehensive questions is the facilities conditions assessment. assessment. So as part of the study, we had multiple teams of architects and engineers out assessing the physical conditions of 15 of the schools and the central kitchen from 3 perspectives, which were architectural, building systems, which is mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, as well as looking at security and IT, and then from the food service perspective. The focus of these assessments was to create an accurate record of the existing conditions that was more comprehensive than the 2015 study report, but building on those findings. And what we are going to be doing in the next section is talking through the recommendations that are coming out of both the educational adequacy and facilities conditions assessments for immediate, intermediate, and long-term needs. So after each team completed their walkthroughs, each team was then analyzing their findings according to the assessment criteria that you see on the screen. The conditions criteria grades the overall quality of the building and the systems, and the priorities criteria sets a time frame for addressing any issues noted. So these criteria are based off of standard tables for useful life of material and equipment, and were applied consistently across all of the schools in like several rounds of review. Across the board, we were honestly just really impressed. The schools were well maintained and clean, and it's obvious that Bill and the facility staff take absolute care and pride in their work. What I wanted to emphasize as we go into this is that the items that we were looking at for the facilities conditions assessment was really more focused on items that aren't obvious from a cursory visual inspection, or even items that aren't really within the normal scope of day-to-day maintenance. So for example, a typical area that we noted in the report that was also noted in the 2015 report, and then we reaffirmed, was the bathrooms at many of the schools. On the outside, because many of them are, or almost all of them are clean and very well maintained, they seem to be in good shape. But as was noted in the previous report, and then we confirmed, many of the fixtures are actually past the end of their useful life and have issues like clogs that are a really big issue, because they can cause you to have to shut the bathrooms down. And then that's without taking into account the additional issues around meeting accessibility code, which many of the bathrooms do not, and that the majority of the fixtures, even if they're functioning well, are inefficient, which causes excess water and sewer costs. So items like this are examples of what we mean by deferred capital maintenance, which is the focus of all of our recommendations from the facilities conditions side. These are things that are larger scale projects that require capital investment and have to be planned in advance, and are generally being treated by third-party professionals. So from this perspective, a wide range of the facilities had almost one would be on one end with one item, but then it would be on the other end with another item. So we really saw a wide range of facilities conditions. And here you can see an overview. The detailed report has all of this so that you can read it. This is, again, just the same as with Jana's, to give an idea of the scope of what's in the detailed report, because the focus of this presentation is to give that executive summary and the high level review. So each school received a conditions and a priority score, as well as having its most pressing items that needed to be addressed pulled forward. There's a significant amount of deferred capital maintenance to be addressed in the coming years. You made progress since the 2015 report, but there were still a lot of the same items, and then another 5 years of those items getting worse. And honestly, this just isn't surprising given the average age of Norwalk school buildings, which is 60 years old. In addition to this detailed review of each school that we did, our team worked together to pull out district-wide recommendations of similar project work in the same way that we saw in the educational adequacy perspective. And so our primary recommendations, our overarching recommendations, fall into these categories. So providing current standards of accessibility and building code compliance, like we mentioned with the restrooms, but it's in lots of other areas as well. Repairs and replacements at the exterior roofs, walls, doors, and windows. Repairs and replacements of interior finishes nearing or past the end of their useful life. So backing up what the educational adequacy assessment saw in terms of interior finishes. And then providing spaces and equipment to support the district's aspirational and operational goals for the future of their food services. This is mainly focused on making and serving food at the schools rather than shipping it from the central kitchen. And replacement of inefficient electrical, mechanical, and plumbing systems and equipment, as well as targeted interventions at building envelopes in a bid to move towards more high performance buildings. And then finally reaffirming the focus on indoor air quality based on what was, and then, just with COVID, the standards have continued to push forward. All of the schools are doing the best that they can based on when the buildings were built and the facilities to the level of where you would want them to be in the future in terms of indoor air quality. And again, all the perspectives, it was something that was noted from all three perspectives in the facilities conditions, as well as energy savings and rebates for upgrades on top of the big returns on education. So let me go back before. Oh, actually, this is our next pause. I thought I had one more thing to say, but I was wrong. So we wanted to give you all another opportunity to ask any further questions that you have in terms of the educational adequacy and facilities conditions assessments before we go into our overarching recommendations and the cost summary.
Rachel, on that slide where we talk about the educational adequacy index, you said that each school got a sort of a score breakdown from 1 to 5. Is that 3.44 an average? What is that? Or just a placeholder?
That's an example. That's actually Brookside score, if you want to know. But so it's to just show how, an example of one school and what you would see. I actually haven't done the math to know what your average school score is across the district. I've only looked at the individual scores of each school, but every school gets a score. And as I said, they range from it's a wide range, as is to be expected, given the fact that some of them are, education in mind when they were built 60 years ago.
So, and I think a large part of this, and this is what we feel pretty strongly about in terms of that data driven, is the score sheet and what is the important criteria is the same for every school. So it's not necessarily Jana walking through Brookside and going, yeah, this feels kind of sort of okay, right? So I think a large part of this is really the process and procedures, to put together the educational adequacy index. And so that's all very transparent, be it board members that look at it, be it the public or whatever. Certainly one can say, well, we don't think this is important. And that's, that becomes part of the prioritization.
Right, absolutely. And we've all heard a million times that the squeaky wheel is the one that gets, the loudest squeaky wheel is the one that gets the oil. And so the intent and the way that we set all of these assessments up and the analysis was to stay away from that and really focus on consistent criteria and data-driven recommendations.
In the interest of data, that's very helpful. Thank you. I think it might be helpful to have a district-wide average just to give a global sense. And it may be helpful to have averages by school level, the average for all our elementary schools, the average for all our middle schools. And some board members may want to know averages by district as well. So just to extra data.
Absolutely. Thank you for that point.
And then the only other question I had, and I'll open it up, is on the physical assessments. You noted that you looked at, was it 15 schools plus central cafeteria?
Yes.
Which schools did you not look at and why?
So it was, I had this list memorized. Jefferson, Ponis, Cranberry, and Norwalk High School. And that's because 3 of them have received recent, very extensive renovations. And then Norwalk High School, as you all know, there's a new high school coming. And so those were not included in the scope of the facilities conditions assessment, though they were included in the educational adequacy assessment.
Makes sense.
Any more questions on this section? Okay, so we're like an hour in. Everybody needs to shake.
Yeah, so Rachel, I just want to say, I can see this student's face. This middle school student was awesome.
Oh yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And he said, if I can finish my work in a few hours, I should be able to do what I want after that. Am I going to be able to do that when I go back to school in fall? So I think there has been such a cultural shift among students, and some have flourished, obviously some have not, but the ones that have flourished, I think there's so much agency that they've established for themselves. It's going to be, both challenges and opportunities when they come back in the fall.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to move on to the next section. So after we all completed our assessments, we did several rounds of analyzing and balancing out all these factors reviewed. Like we've talked about, really focus on keeping it consistent and data-driven. And importantly, as we did this analysis and several rounds of reviews, we included the superintendent and her staff, as well as the facilities team, and then any other specialists or focused department heads that made sense as we wrapped up. And the end result was a tiered approach to our recommendations, which is broken down over the next 20 years. So each school was tiered as a whole, but there are also several multi-school projects of similar and targeted works that we pulled forward. Some of this comes from the overarching recommendations from the educational adequacy and facilities conditions side, and then some of it comes from ongoing conversations that were going on in addition to those. As we dive in, I just really want to emphasize that the intent of this report was to develop the optimal recommendations for the district schools and provide a framework for decision making that supports your values and your goals as you look towards the future of Norwalk public school system. So as Pam mentioned, this is our recommendations based on our global experience and our professional experiences and understanding, and there's always going to be a gap between the amount of information we were able to bring together in 12 weeks and then what comes up tomorrow, even in your district. And so the way that we've set this up is to be flexible to react to changing understandings and needs. And that this tiering approach is really a key piece of that framework for decision making. So I'm just going to go through each of the pieces and then we'll round out with the cost summary. So in year one, the focus was placed on critical maintenance items such as broken or malfunctioning equipment or hazardous conditions. In support of these more pragmatic items, we also recommended that the first part of the flexible furniture upgrades and providing MECO shades for glare control and energy savings, because these items have the most return on educational outcomes. And also that it's an equitable spread across all of the schools in the district and improvements of that nature. The schools in tier one were prioritized over the next 10 years due to their combined facilities, conditions, and educational adequacy needs. Due to the nature of funding and the efficiencies to be had from such an approach, the schools in tier one are all recommended to receive full renovations that grab all of the items that need fixed and also adds in that focus on future facing learning and supporting it with your spaces. So part one, which is years 2 to 5, focuses on 3 schools that on top of their overall tier 1 level needs, also have the farthest to go in terms of meeting current standards for ventilation and air conditioning, which we've seen has become extra key coming out of COVID, but as we've been saying, is also very key to educational outcomes. So these are Fox Run, Merrimack, and West Rocks. The 4th and 5th piece of part 1 is the South Norwalk and expansion or new of Columbus Magnet School. So as you've seen, this was kind of a parallel developing item that came forward and has really been pushed as we continue to talk with the community. So we've included it as part of part 1 for the tier 1 facilities. The part 2 includes the renovation of the central preparation kitchen to support the shift to school-based food prep, as well as Nathan Hale, Roten, and Wolf Pit schools. The multi-school projects for tier 1 are the lighting upgrades that you've heard us say again, and that the second part of the flexible furniture and MECO shades in the remaining schools that aren't hit by part 1. The tier 2 schools, which are recommended for years 11 to 15, are recommended for a mix of full and targeted renovations. This is kind of going to change as time goes past and you see how the schools wear and what they need. And it includes Marvin, Rowayton, Silvermine Magnet, and Tracy Magnet. The tier 2 multi-school projects includes needed repairs and replacements at the outside of all the school buildings, things like fixing walls, fixing rust at the steel structures, replacing roofs, windows, and doors that are past the end of their useful life. And it also includes safety and security upgrades, things like secure vestibules and sprinkler systems at schools currently missing them, and targeted interventions to support the idea of schools as community centers, which has again and again been brought up as a goal for the district in the future. So one example of this is making gyms and auditoriums safely available after hours, and this is achieved by targeted cross hallway door setups, as well as the inclusion of the secure vestibules. The tier 3 facilities are schools that are recommended mostly only for targeted renovations. Again, this is 15 to 20 years out, so you never know what's going to happen. And I know that it seems wild since Brian McMahon was definitely only built like yesterday, but in 15 years, it's actually going to be over 30 years old. And 30 years is the lifetime of most roofs in the district, and significantly more than the useful life for many finishes and pieces of equipment. We don't include tier 4 as a separate slide, as you can see on this overall plan, because it was those 4 schools that we listed that have received recent interventions. And so they mostly are just getting operational educational adequacy recommendations in the detailed report. So I'm going to let this sit for a second. I know that it seems like a lot, but your district is recognizing that schools are critical infrastructure, and as such, they require continuous investment. So we hope that this framework that we're setting up allows the district to make the decisions they need over the next 20 years to achieve their goals. And sorry, I lost my mouse. Part of that is recognizing that you have to build in opportunities to check back and make sure that changing circumstances haven't changed your priorities for what you're working on in these schools. So we recommend a 5-year check-in to validate and verify the progress and path of the report, as well as a 10-year full reassessment, because you honestly, in 10 years, you're hoping that you're on the path and you know what's coming, but there could be another COVID, there could be a surge of funding for schools, you never know. And so the way that we are making recommendations in the report is to also recommend checking back in with how things are progressing over time, instead of just kind of dropping it and saying, here's the path, follow it along. So I wasn't going to pause here to ask for questions before I dive into the few slides for the cost summary, if that's okay, unless anybody has anything burning to ask before we dive into the cost summary, and then we'll have our final Q&A session.
I'd like to bring up one thing before we
Sure.
So I'm a little surprised, you did talk about HVAC and you want to improve ventilation kind of tied to COVID, but more importantly, a lot of our schools don't have air conditioning at all.
Absolutely.
And some of those schools are tier 2. So I'm kind of surprised, like, why they're not in tier 1 if they don't have air conditioning.
So the district has an ongoing development of air conditioning at the schools. And so we've separated out what we know is ongoing from what should be centralized renovations that include fully centralized and up to current standards renovations of air conditioning systems. So you actually have in progress a plan, I think, over the next couple of years to get the window shakers into every single school and have air conditioning at all of the learning spaces. And there's also an ongoing plan to get centralized air to all of the gyms, and you're making good progress on that. So that's the reason that some of those are in tier 2, is because there are short-term interventions already planned. And what we would recommend is that you go with your short-term interventions that are functional. And then because of the way state funding works and because of the efficiencies that you can get from larger renovations rather than just targeted HVAC upgrades, that you then do a full system rework in the tier 2, which is about when the AC units that are in progress will be reaching the end of their useful life.
But I will say, and I imagine you looked into this, but these kind of interim air conditioning steps are, to put it nicely, bogus. And on a 95-degree day, I forget the exact numbers, but I think they'd only get the classroom to, 78 degrees, it's not real air conditioning.
Sure.
It's better than nothing, granted, but it's not what, schools that are fully air conditioned benefit from. I'm just saying.
You're
I know
at-
you had all these breakout sessions, and I'm surprised you didn't get more feedback from teachers, staff, parents who, are kind of like, it's the 21st century. Let's get real here.
You're absolutely right. I think, and in the following slides, you'll also see sort of some of the other method to the madness of why we have the tiers the way that we do, because I think that there's only so much that you can bite off at one time and be successful. And in some cases, you have to be able to pace yourself. So I think that what we tried to do is understand what could happen now and what was already in the works, and then, put it all in the perspective of the full, both not only the need of what needs to be done, but actually then also how can it be afforded.
Yeah, a lot of conversations related to funding realities.
Absolutely. But I will say, if we could recommend, and it would be feasible, that you just do all of the things for all of the schools right now, that would absolutely be highest priority. The way that we've set this up again is, and we did hear that the heating and cooling is an issue at many schools, and you'll see that many of those schools are in tier 1, but we had to take, and look at the whole surround of what the needs are for the schools, and that's what we based the priorities and how they fit into the tiers. And again, this could just be this is meant to be a dynamic report and set of recommendations. So if it comes to a place where, all of a sudden there's a grant for centralized air and you can get it into a bunch of schools, then we would never say don't do that. This is just the best recommendations that we can make based on the pragmatic understanding of the big picture.
And then one other thing I just wanted to ask, the useful life of a school building is, in your book, is 20 years or 30?
That's a question.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It depends on when it was built. 60s buildings don't have the same useful life as, say, a 1920s building. So,
right.
But the systems, the enclosure and the windows, definitely do have a deferred maintenance tag that gets carried with it. So there isn't necessarily a one size fits all answers. I'm sorry, Jana, go ahead.
So I was going to say, it actually isn't that clean a separation. So when you have a school that was built in the 1920s and it has just a really good structure and it has a beautiful edifice and it's just like really some wonderful spaces that are oftentimes in that vintage of school, the school itself can have a life that's perpetual as long as it's being upgraded. But the systems that were put in, mechanical systems typically only have a life of about 20 to 25 years. The roof will be somewhere between 25 and 30. Windows, they're, can be around 30. And if they're, depending on what kind they are, they can have a little bit, potentially even longer life than that. So different things phase out at different times. And so it really, that's why keeping track of the different elements of the building and making sure that they are optimally functioning is real important. If I'm just going to take a slight deviation, if you're building a new school, by investing and focusing that investment on those exteriors, which last longer, you can actually reduce the size of the systems that you put into the building, and you spend less money on the things that are going to cycle out at 20, 25 years, more money on the things that cycle out at 30, 35 years. And overall, that's a better return on your investment, and it improves the indoor experience.
The reason I bring this question up is I think it will help us in our pitch to the city, because they're paying for this, is, we have 20 campuses. You're saying, roughly things break down after 20 years. So basically every year we should be doing a major renovation.
Yes.
On one of our buildings.
That is what you're about to see next. Yes.
I've been on the board 10 years. We've done
You got it.
One.
Yep.
And so I think what needs to be, it's a lesson, that you have to give that people don't realize is that you can't just build these schools and forget them.
Right.
And that every year we should be investing, and we haven't been. Mm-hmm. And so there's this, you were referred in your report and you're talking about tonight, deferred maintenance. And this is a really big issue. And that, it's like with your own house, if you delay that stuff, it only gets more expensive. And so there needs to be, as you've done, laid out kind of a 10, 20-year plan that's got to be funded every year.
Yes.
Because these are assets that they're at the end of the day, they're deteriorating assets that have to be maintained.
Right.
And so I hope in all your presentations, you should almost start with that, because there needs to be, we need to educate our stakeholders who are part of this decision-making process and are funding this. They have to understand this, because they just think we're money grabbing, spending crazies. Right. And there's much more to it than that, which they don't appreciate.
Right. And in a perfect world, you would start to, if you will, build up a kitty. I mean, Brian McMahon is really a fantastic conversation, because it was like, what do you mean we're going to have to replace, mechanical equipment? But deferred maintenance also means, when is the life expectancy going to be gone? And so you have to plan to replace it and or fix it, right? So
again,
a rainy day fund, I think she was trying to say.
Right.
Absolutely. And recognizing, that this is, we're all laughing because we've heard this so many times with every district that we work with, that we've heard it again and again. And that was going to be the first thing I was going to say as we go into the cost summary, is that there's probably some sticker shock when we look at these numbers, but it is not surprising if you're looking at other districts that are investing as they should in their schools. And so we're 100% on board with you, and that really in the end is the intent of this report, is to give you the data-driven, almost ammunition to go and have these conversations. And we have seen again and again that it's effective once you can see all of the backup.
We were just all impressed that you got there without even seeing the numbers.
We were. You all are on top of things. Okay, so I've just got a few slides on the overview of the cost summary. So I'm going to go through those, and then we'll stop for the final round of questions. And hopefully we'll just, you all keep prophesizing what we're going to say, and it's all just going to be easy. Okay, so overall, like I just said, the cost estimates might have some sticker shock. I'm going to let you all look at these and just make a couple of notes. They're not surprising for a district of Norwalk size. They do relate to about a renovation of a school a year, especially if you break down the costs of that middle schools are more than elementary schools, and high schools are even more. And so the breakdown is around 20 to 30 million of spending a year. And I'll just give you all a second to look at this, and then we'll look at it, how it breaks down across a more graphic timeline, because I know that's helpful for people to see as well. Okay. So, and another piece of this conversation, and I'm less scared to say this now, these numbers are unescalated, and escalation information is going to be included in the detailed report. Escalation right now is holding at 5% plus, and it doesn't look like it's going to go away from that. There's lots of other districts that are in the same situation that you all are, that they've got aging building stock, a lot of it that was built all at the same time and needs updates all at the same time, as well as significant deferred maintenance because of a lack of funding and a lack of understanding about what you need in terms of funding. So you kind of preempted me. I was going to say, what do all of these numbers mean? This means that you need to be continuously investing in your schools, not to fall behind, but also to just keep them basically functioning. So what we're looking at is a 20-year plan that is focusing primarily on deferred capital maintenance. It's over 2/3 of the kind of menu of items that we've put together in the detailed cost breakdown. There's the school building boom going on right now. You know that you have this building, or there's a school building renovation boom going on right now because of the school building boom that was happening in the late 50s to the early 70s, and it's coming calling. And so it's going to be important to get ahead of your building needs before you have breakages that cause shutdowns, which is a lot of these deferred capital maintenance items, especially the ones that are tiered more closely to right now, are the things that could potentially cause shutdowns. And that's a really big issue for districts that they're facing right now. So we put together this menu of needs and their costs, and we're hoping we're setting you up to have an opportunity to make strategic spending decisions that are going to transform your schools as you're getting to that baseline functioning standard, but also get you up to the global standards of best practices that we keep hearing from your stakeholders that they want, and tying all of that back to intentional engagement with your unique and really enthusiastic community that has their own set of goals and their own set of things that they'd like to see in these schools. So on that note, I'm going to pass it to Pam to wrap us up, and then we'll take all the questions that you could ever have.
Before you get off of the slide, the only thing I just want to reiterate one more time, these are today's dollars.
Yep.
It's the cost analysis that you have before you on this slide is in today's dollars. So when you do the math for those projects that are 15 years out, 20 years out, unless something drastic happens, they will indeed cost more than that because of the escalation in prices. And I just wanted to say that one more time, because people oftentimes hold on to numbers and then they'll be like, well, you said 10 years ago that it was going to cost this. Why doesn't it cost this now? And it's because of that escalation. And in the report, we give estimates of what of the dollars in that escalated format as well. So you can see both, and that can help you even make decisions on should we do it now or should we wait? Because inevitably it always costs more if you wait.
Awesome. Thanks, Jana. So once again, I want to bring it back to the kids, right? So a lot of our sorting and conversations with Dr. Estrella, Dr. Costanza, with Tom Hamilton, with Bill Hodel, with Brenda, with lots of people is really prioritization based on those three kind of goalposts that we talked about, that Dr. Estrella talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And so that's why some of the conversations related to furniture, related to some of these educational adequacies. How can we be sure that we're balancing, if you will, those shifts in culture that will be even more important when kids come back to school with some of the deferred maintenance conversations, and how can you and should you, get best value? And so this really maps out the needs. We had some great conversations starting to look at funding sources, like for instance, with say fluorescent lights, they're performance-based contracts that are starting to shift lights, change out lights, and you can be the company gets basically the change in savings for X amount of years, and then you own that cost savings and operational costs afterwards. So we did not dive into any of those conversations. That was not really part of the scope of this facilities plan. But what we really focused on is needs and trying to put together as clear and accurate picture of everything that we know are issues locally, regionally, nationally, so that you have a roadmap for robust conversations. And so Q&A, should we go back to any of those number sheets? Because I'm sure there'll be some comments or questions about that.
I do have one question about some of these numbers tied to the 2, 1, 2, and 3. Earlier when you were answering Mike's question about the HVAC, you mentioned that you did not necessarily incorporate some of the existing and ongoing capital projects. And so when we look at these numbers—
You're on mute, Rachel.
Could I put in a correction before that is a correction of if I said it wrong. We did include those things, and that fed into how we tiered the schools. So we are not, for an example of the HVAC, there is nowhere where we are recommending that the long-term solution is to stick with the window units. All of this costing for pretty much every school includes a fully centralized system up to current standards.
But Rachel, I think the question is is the short-term costs of temporary, are those costs included in these numbers at all, or that's in a separate pot that's already been encumbered?
The latter.
Okay.
In
Sorry,
the
if you'd
same
like to
way-
finish your question.
Yes, that was my question.
Okay.
And also, you know, if we're supposed to kind of, which I think is the intent, look at this new report layered on top of the last facilities report we did 6 years ago, are those sort of call outs identified in the full report?
Yes, so in the assessment documents that will be included as part of the report, any items that were included in the 2015 report and carried over that weren't seen as completed are marked out, are called out.
Yep.
Great, thank you.
I should add that within the prior report, it did not necessarily include soft costs or escalation.
Correct. It also, you know, it was, I really liked how our cost estimator, Michael O'Reilly, put this. It was asking a different question than we were here. And so it's not to say that it was a bad report, but to recognize that the question it was asking was not as holistic as the one that we were asking as we were walking the schools. And it also didn't include the high schools.
That's right.
And actually, that I wanted to add this point. Michael has actually also worked up a breakdown of the differences between this report and the 2015 report, and that'll be included as a supplement with this report. So he's made it easy for you all to see where the differences are in terms of scope, in terms of soft costs, et cetera.
That in addition to the 459 pages?
It's a spreadsheet. It's not an extra report. It's a spreadsheet.
It's in the appendix right now.
Well, I just want to say, I think that the tiered approach is very helpful in looking at this as a multi-year approach. And as Mike mentioned, you know, we have to basically be able to translate this to our partners across the city and the state. And I think it's helpful just to kind of think of it as tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I appreciate that you included our plans for the South Norwalk School and a new CMS in tier 1. I think it reflects the top priority of those two projects for us. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. And those numbers are based off of the study previously done in support of that work.
I just want to circle back to the question Heidi had before in terms of the outdoor classrooms. Do you feel that question was answered, or do you want us to go deeper into that?
Yeah, I think, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind just going a little bit deeper. I know we've discussed before, you know, outdoor learning and learning commons and flexible seating, and, you know, we discussed library media centers as far as, you know, kind of being the hub of each school. But it is important that we kind of just go back a little bit more just about the outdoor learning spaces and what that might look like, and how that would look differently from, let's say, elementary, middle, and high school.
So I think that one of the things that it is important to do is understand the types of activities that you want to achieve. And quite honestly, make sure that your teachers are engaged and have that they want to use it. I can't tell you how many times there's, say, an outdoor learning opportunity, but then because it's not part of the curriculum, it's not actually used. Now, maybe people have a different perspective now because everybody understands that being outside in the fresh air could even potentially be safer. And you absolutely have wonderful spaces where I'll say people can be contained, as well as, you know, making sure that nobody else can get in. The way that your buildings are organized as their existing layouts are mostly easily, then you can define those outdoor spaces by adding just a fence here and there to close off an opening and that sort of thing. Beyond that, though, I think it's about making sure that it has the same kinds of opportunities you would have in an indoor space, in that it's the ability for kids to get together and have conversation, both in groups of whether it be, you know, 2s or 4s or 8s or 12s, as well as then having the opportunity for presentations where you might have an entire class or an entire 2 class. I've seen examples and developed examples, everything from using, quite honestly, little stumps for seating and benches if you don't want to invest in, say, the typical outdoor furniture for that type of thing, cut off. I actually, in one of my projects, used a mast from a ship out of the Connecticut, right there off the coast of Connecticut, near Mystic, as we sliced it up and had little stools that were outdoors and will last forever because they're basically petrified wood at this point. But there's a lot of ways to reinvent how can we provide seating outside, and then ways to provide actually writing surfaces and that sort of thing, using either pieces of slate or movable things that actually can be brought outside, like small, I saw examples of say rolling whiteboards, but that type of thing where they can actually engage. So that's one side of things. That's sort of taking a more traditional approach of doing activities that would normally be done inside and bringing it outside. The other opportunities, whereas you actually focus on the outside, and that's whether it's using gardens. You actually do have quite a few gardens. Wolf Pit has a wonderful garden. Rowayton has a wonderful garden. There's many, in fact, Jefferson has a wonderful garden, and I hope that it's brought back when the new school is built, where kids are actually out there can do science experiments, can learn about nutrition, can learn about the nature and the water cycle, and a lot of environmental stewardship topics can be taught in those kinds of environments. You also in different locations even have opportunities for like nature walks and butterfly gardens and other things like that, where you're actually focusing on the outside. So I think that it's about understanding the curriculum and how you're trying to move it to the outdoors. And then what do you need in support of that? And is it merely just a tablet or, like a little camera, or is it actually something that's more formal? But definitely those courtyards that currently exist, again, Rowayton's a great example, really use those. You have a lot of doors that already spill out into the landscape, making sure that you have perimeters to keep kids contained and safe, and really use those spaces that you already have.
Thank you. And I'm thinking also being as simple or as creative as, we have outdoor spacing, but using towels if we needed to. We're having children here, students sitting outside. And we also talked about lighting, like indoor lighting versus natural lighting and outdoor lighting, and just having, a bright sunny day where you have groups of students that are having robust conversations with their peers, and whether it's writers workshop or reading workshop or science, and having a science lab outside. I think just kind of incorporating the inside and the outside, and not just necessarily the COVID environment, but kind of moving forward, right. Having that, that outdoor space, I think, is really important. Obviously, inclement weather is an issue, but as much as we can, using the kind of the outdoor indoor space and kind of combining the two when we can, I think we can really benefit our students, not only our students, but our staff as well.
Yep.
The other thing
I was just going to add that there's lots of organizations that, be it Green Schools or others, that are really focused on outdoor curriculum, and in some ways how that really relates back to local culture and context. And, as kids start to better understand their local environment, it gives them a little more resiliency in terms of some of the social and emotional behaviors that are important. And so we're doing a lot more studies on that, and really programming outdoor play and outdoor learning and outdoor community spaces in a much more specific way than just kind of having, a green space with grass that gets, dies over time, and then it's just a little bit of a barren piece of dirt that nobody uses. Right. So there's certainly a lot of conversations related to the benefits of outdoor learning, just changing your focal length and other things like that. So, I'm so glad you raised this, because it's a very important topic.
And just last thing, our schools will have a lot of say in that, like each respective individual schools might be doing it differently, but still making it very productive and worthwhile for their school. So I think kind of looking at that through a different lens in each particular school, I think would be helpful for us as a district. And when you look at the West Coast, a lot of the schools have lockers outside. We would never think of that, but because a lot of their schools, they do a lot of their learning outdoors, they have their lockers outside. So I'm not saying we necessarily would do that, but I think we could learn from other states and even in warmer climates, how they make that successful.
The one other thing I will add is controlling that sun is incredibly important. I don't know if you've ever tried to read a book out at the beach. And if you don't have that beach umbrella, the glare is so intense that you really can't hardly even see the words on the page. It's no different in the backyard setting or in the courtyard setting at the school, and that having shade structures, whether it be the natural foliage that's on the trees or whether it be a purposeful shade structure so that kids can get underneath and actually see what they're doing if they are interacting or needing to read or that type of thing. The advantage of that, though, is like it's a twofer, is if it's thoughtfully planned, it can actually reduce the sun and heat gain that actually gets into the building as well. Like think of it as like creating porches. I think that there's ways that those kinds of interventions could be done, and it could actually solve more than one issue and be really, really wonderful. But definitely shade is also a consideration as you're planning for these activities to think about, and where do you already have it and where would you like to enhance it?
I just want to add, we have a cohort of schools that have started conversations around outdoor classrooms. I know Cranberry received a grant to start one as well. So Bill Holdell has a meeting set with a few schools that have been expressing interest in doing this. And we're going to work with them to make sure that we can create these outdoor spaces over the course of the next few months.
That would be great to share that back, with the board. And even if we had I'm just thinking future-wise, if we had a presentation, let's say whatever school we, kind of look into more and having those discussions and conversations. But I think bringing it back to the board and then sharing those best practices with other schools. So I know that there's a grant, but maybe we can incorporate that within some of our other schools as well.
And some have grants, some don't. So we're going to work with them.
That's great.
So we'll definitely do that.
Can I ask, going back to the, how much this is going to cost? When we were talking about some of the demographic projections earlier, you mentioned in response to a question that those numbers were kind of based on right sizing, for example, a Roten school. And knowing that, we have to get buy-in, not just from our partners in the city, but also at the state level to finance this. When you talk about right sizing a school like Roten, for example, are you using standards that are set by the Connecticut School Building Department?
Guidelines.
Guidelines. I've been make sure it's always guidelines. But the answer is yes. We've been using their worksheets and like their recommendations for the square foot per student has been derived from what they put in their guidelines. The reason why I say it's derived is because they have, like in their worksheets, they will say that a fifth grade classroom should be 900 square feet. And then when you read into that, what you find out is that's based on 25 kids per classroom. So when you do the math, then you actually come up with a square foot per student. And they're like, there's a different number for the really young kids at kindergarten and pre-K. There's actually a different number that's applied to high school labs and a different number that's applied to middle school and application labs. But yes, we haven't. And one of the first criteria when I'm assessing a space that the very first one is, is this in alignment with the Connecticut standards? Guidelines. Sorry, thank you, Pam.
Because I think that's a really important point, because Norwalk has been doing a lot with a little. It's not that you can't put 22 kindergartners in a 660 square foot space, but it doesn't necessarily meet the state guidelines. And so when your enrollment exceeds your capacity, you do what you have to do, right? you do what you have to do because you need to take care of the kids. And so I think that, I don't know if you all remember that first presentation where I said bricks and mortar are not static. And people can say, oh, I remember when there were 500 kids at that school. Why can it only take 300? So the guidelines and some of the conversations around special ed, around English as a second language, et cetera, affect the capacity, which is different than the enrollment and the projections for growth, right? So the two should merge, but it is certainly not unusual to always have that dynamic tension between those two numbers. And if you have, what we didn't really go over, and I guess it's in the May meeting where Mike is going to really talk about the enrollment projections that then have to be layered on the specifics of the capacity.
I know that's very helpful. I think where they call them standards or guidelines, we know that there are certain check marks we have to hit in order to get maximum reimbursement. And one may certainly argue that we should get more money from the state, but what we do get is vital to making these things happen. So we want to make sure that.
For sure.
Yeah.
So the only other thing I will say is, as by way of explanation, is even when you pull the worksheets that are directly from the state website, I'm not creating these come from Connecticut. There are 2 pages, and there's a summary page that has to do with, it's just a rote, like you put in the number of students and it spits out a square foot per student that is part of the reimbursable square footage. However, there's another template, another sheet that has to do with the recommended sizes for spaces. And when you fill out that worksheet with your program, like you put in the number of student or number of classrooms that you need for kindergarten and all that, and all the various things and admin and gym and all of that, it is not uncommon that the two are not completely in alignment and that there will be a modest amount that would be considered unreimbursable square footage. And that is just the state of Connecticut needed a way so that they would equally apply to all districts what they were going to fund. It's no different than many other states. In Massachusetts, they have a similar sort of like way of looking at things, and that they will only fund up to too much. But at the same time, they're not saying that is all that you need, or that's all that you can build, because their own template of what they recommend will inevitably, almost every single time, come up with more square footage than what just the baseline number of, square foot on a per student basis. So there is that disconnect, and you should always be making sure that you're comfortable if you're making compromises between those two numbers and understand that delta.
So let me add just one other statement, because a couple decades ago, there was the GAO report, the General Accounting Office report about the state of our schools, that kind of was submitted to Congress. And it really talked about deferred maintenance. It's an interesting point in time because, there is a lot more research on how kids learn and whatever. And so I think that going forward in the next couple years, particularly triggered by all of the conversations around COVID, particularly, centered around the conversations now about hybrid learning when kids return, centered on conversations around equity, there is not necessarily a major understanding that there are these multiple components that really allow your buildings to function appropriately and allow your teachers, your students to do their job of teaching and learning. And so those conversations with funding agencies, like for instance, I know Connecticut is part of the National Council of School Buildings that we're a member of, are happening all the time around policy and funding. And so I think the more that you can shed light on these conversations, to me, the better, right? Because it's changing. So I would just put that out as perhaps an optimistic note, or at least that's how I view it.
You know, when you think about the funding, one of the things that was really interesting as they were talking about the Relief Act was that these funds could potentially be utilized for capital projects, particularly around the HVAC systems and things that would mitigate some of the challenges or situations that COVID has created. Unfortunately, we can't utilize the funds in the way that the descriptions articulate, because now we have to utilize the funds to balance our budget. But one of the conversations we were having in cabinet as a possible way of one possible way of utilizing the resource was addressing the HVAC issue that we have at Norwalk and some of the schools that don't have adequate ventilation in certain areas of the building. So I think as we think about the capital projects ahead, we really need to prioritize these things, especially now that the resources that we were hoping to utilize for some of these immediate needs now have to be utilized in very different ways.
Very good.
Any further questions?
Other questions, comments, reactions? I do want to say, and I think, you know, we said it. We want to think about facilities as more than boilers and bathrooms. We want to think about it as ideal learning spaces. And based on this executive summary, I think that's exactly what we've been able to get out of it. So I really appreciate what we've been able to hear tonight. So thank you.
Well, thank you for engaging us in this conversation. I think this is one of many more conversations. Once you get to see the full report, you will see how dense and thorough the work and the content is, and it will give you more insight about the work ahead. I hope this sets the path to forward thinking and visionary thinking, because the work that we need to do to bring our facilities up to date and in a path of progress based on the scope of work that has been articulated tonight is going to require concerted effort, not only from us, but also the city as well as the state, so we ensure that we have the best possible environments for all of our students, regardless of where they live. We want to ensure that our facilities are up to standard and beyond, so that our students have the ability to excel, whether it's in an outdoor environment, inside the school infrastructure, and in the surrounding areas. We're hoping that as we continue our equity dialogue, we think about our infrastructure in a similar fashion, but that we also think about it in a very progressive manner also, that thinking about now is important, but thinking about the current need as well as linking it to the future is just as essential. Because if we just think about the moment, then we won't have the foresight we need to think about the future ahead. So I'm hoping that this will propel more conversations with Common Council, with our mayor, who has been working with us in trying to address some of the facilities need. And hopefully this builds a deeper understanding for the community to understand that deferred maintenance has a additional cost associated to it. The more we wait, the more it's going to cost, and the more our systems will deteriorate. So it not only will it cost more to do the things that we need now, but it's going to cost more to add the additional things that we might not be anticipating in the moment. And our kids deserve the best, and the environment that they go into matters, because it allows for all of the other elements that we bring into the space to happen successfully. So again, thank you for joining us in this dialogue that I think is one of many.
If I could just add, piggyback onto that, Alex, you brought up some great points. And I think instead of just looking at the now, I think we have to keep one step ahead. Because you never know what's going to happen. And I think if we just look at the future and the maintenance of our buildings, our facilities, we really have to project versus the now, but also looking at the future.
And I think as the team articulated, our facilities team has done an exceptional work at making sure that with what we have the best possible environment for our students. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And when you look at the full report, you will see in some of the pictures and data collected that it's not just the facade and appearance in the exterior, it's the internal structures that deteriorate over time that we need to address. I mean, we've had some situations where things clog and creates the need to shut down certain areas of the building. And a lot of it is because it's time for change and to update. So I'm hoping that this sparks really rich dialogue that will lead to a lot of progressive change.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you to the team. I think we've worked really well together. It's been a pleasure joining you in this initiative. And I know we need to follow up on the outdoor classroom conversation that Bill has organized. So we're probably going to seek for your guidance as well in some of the work we have slated ahead. So again, we really appreciate the work you've done in a very short amount of time.
Well, I just have to, chime in. We could not have done what we've done without all of the work and support, Alex, of you and your staff. To the board members, you have an extraordinary group of people that are passionate about your kids. And that's not something I say lightly, because this was a very aggressive schedule and it could not have been met if there wasn't, your folks on a day's notice, 2 days notice would pull together a team to talk about different topics. And so that's truly extraordinary. So thank you so much. It really has been, if you will, a labor of love.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good. Feels like a really good start to some more conversations like this. So
Yes. I can't wait until the 4th to really look at the whole district. And
Yeah.
really fight
And this will help align.
and see, I can't wait.
something about it all comes together, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. That was our workshop topic for tonight. The next agenda item is public comments, and we did not get any via email. I don't know if we have any.
Yeah, so if anybody that's still participating online, if you want to participate in public comments, please raise your hand right now. I take that as a no, so I think we're good.
Okay.
I do have a question. From what I sent via email, like about next steps from the conversation that we had about Columbus and the South Norwalk School, where are we with that?
I think I can tell you what I know and Alex can fill in, but we have a meeting on the 27th with some of the folks at the state level to kind of give them a sense of where we are and get some early feedback. We are working with Alan Lowe and his team on the city side to then kind of map out. There are a couple of things that we probably need, I would say procedural things. For example, if the capital appropriation that has already been approved needs to be revised in order to reflect 2 schools on one site, wherever that site may be. We may need to vote on that, even though we all agree that we need to have that vote and then have the council vote on it. So stuff like that. Yeah.
Our goal is to kind of continue the conversation with the city so that May 4th, we can set into the agenda some of the recommendations that the board would have to approve to move forward.
So we've totally nixed the plan. I know that the original plan A was to build Columbus in a different location and to have the schools on a separate location. So now are we locked into definitely building 2 schools on one site? Or is that what we're gonna vote on?
For the time being, that's what we're gonna recommend because it's one of the most cost-effective ways of being able to move the projects forward and allow both sides. If we're acquiring a piece of property, it would allow both sides to have a new infrastructure.
And so I know during that last meeting, there was sort of this hurrah that we might be able to meet some of the June deadlines or the July deadlines. Are we still trying for that? Or are we totally given up on that?
I don't think we can meet that deadline if we're gonna go through the process of the plan. So the option that we have presented at the District B conversation and we presented at the previous board meeting, we were gonna try to see if we could hit the June deadline. And even then it was a very ambitious goal.
So as far as purchasing the land, are we pushing this out another year? Or are we gonna purchase the land in good faith that we are gonna build? Like, I'm not totally understanding.
So that would be something that we would have to further discuss with the city because the city is the one that will go through the process of land acquisition. Our goal is that we are continuing the conversation. Mr. Tom Hamilton and I had a conversation today because he followed up with Alan Lowe and we agreed that we were gonna have some follow-up dialogue this week in terms of determining the next steps that we need to take. Because a lot of the processes lie on the city side. We just focus on approving the concept that we want to move forward with. Well, the board approves a concept they want to move forward with. But in terms of the BOE, our commitment is to continue to push the work forward because we can't wait till April of next year to talk about the purchase. The purchase needs to be happening soon in order for us to meet next June's deadline, if that's where we're headed at that point.
And then there was also, somebody brought up the point of seeing if they could get a reimbursement for that additional land that they purchased. So that might be a way to get some money. I just don't want the momentum to be lost just because, you know, we didn't go with Plan C.
And I think what we're doing now, and Alex is sort of leading the charge, is to your question about pushing the land in good faith. It's I think they've made that commitment, but one thing that we need to do to make sure is that the state is going to commit to their reimbursement as well.
Right.
And it kind of almost has to happen simultaneously because they're not going to push land until the state says yes, and the state needs to know that you have land control in order to approve it. And so I think that's what those conversations in the next few weeks will allow us to do. It's, you know, we just need to get ready in a room and say, like, can we just make this happen? Yeah.
Thank you.
I would say from where I sit, I feel like there is momentum now because everybody's saying we want this school. So nobody's saying no. So now we just need to make it happen.
And I just want to reassure that like the momentum is not going to end. In my part, we're going to keep pushing. My team has been actively engaging the city and other constituents on this matter. It's a matter of just finalizing the elements that we need to bring forward to the board as a recommendation for approval. Once we get through that process, then it's mainly in the hands of the city and the processes that need to take place to acquire the land. Because until we acquire the land, we can't submit an application.
Yep,
with the
I know that for sure. So has anybody thought to perhaps prioritize, like they prioritize in tiers, but we have like 3 things on the table. We've got the 2 schools in South Norwalk, we've got Cranberry, and we've got Norwalk High.
And Jefferson.
Jefferson. Sorry, yeah, definitely.
So those other, like they say, those other ships have sailed. So those things are in progress. The priority right now in terms of the work moving forward is the South Norwalk School and CMS in terms of the tiering priority. That's why when they showed the graph where they articulated the schools that fell in tier 1.
Yep.
Columbus and South Norwalk were in that tier. It was separated just because the needs of the 3 other schools was different than the need of creating a new building. But it's at the top of the list based on what we need to focus on around facilities for the next few months and for the course of the next 2 to 5 years.
All right, thank you.
Sarah.
I'll do that. Briefly, sorry, I'm late. And also, I think it would be awesome if it were possible to, in these conversations, generate a really simple chart that says the board will do these steps while the city is doing these steps for us and for everybody else, because I think one of the trickiest things about this is that all of these conversations with the community, it's difficult for everybody to be on the same page and have clarity about what's happening and who's responsible for what. So that's just my.
That's a good point, Sarah.
So we requested the steps and on the list, and I can forward those to the entire board. The first step is for the board to approve the new concept. So that's what we're getting clarity from the city around in terms of what we can build or what we can do given the resources that we have. And we want to have the conversation with the state as well, because we don't want to come up with a concept that then will be denied.
I just wanted to add something different. I don't know if anybody else wanted to add anything else about this before I jump in on something else. Okay. There's just some unfortunate news that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. One of our own Norwalk High School graduate, Thomas Pisano, recently passed away unexpectedly. He was the brass captain of our Norwalk High School marching band, well loved by family and friends. And it just was unexpected and very, very tragic. So I felt it was important for us as a board and for the community to know if we could please have a moment of silence for him. His name is Thomas Pisano.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And our condolences to his entire family. Yeah. Okay, so Sarah, hi.
Hi.
We did not, nobody put up their hands for public comment. Okay. So our next item on the agenda is going to be held in executive session. So we're going to go into a private discussion on a personnel matter before coming back. And so I just want to.
Yes, we'll close this out and then I'll start a new live stream later on for it.
And if you could just email me what I need to do or.
Oh, yeah, no.
No, he's gonna be here.
Oh, okay, great. Good. Thank you.
It's a new system, we're not doing.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Motion to.
Motion to.
I motion.
I think the adjournment is after the.
No, I motion to go into executive.
Oh, yes, thank you. And all in favor?
Aye.
Great, we're moving into executive session.